Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. This one, Holocaust Denial. Who wrote this? Why have they not put their name on the script? Who wrote this script? Tell me. I believe it's Arnaldo. I think it's Arnaldo. Did Arnaldo read I don't know. It'll be in the credits. I'm so sorry if whoever wrote this. Add your name to the script and I'll get it better and I'll do it better in the future. Maybe it's George. Oh God. Well, yes, today we're covering a rather grim subject, aren't we? Less room for jokes when talking about Holocaust denial because it's crazy. There are many if you're new here, the format is I'm going to read this script written by mystery author. Strong feeling it's George, looking at the formatting of this thing, but not sure. George, your name will be in the credits if it's you. I'm going to call you George from now on. And if someone else who formats stuff like this, Arnaldo, if it's you, I apologize. Just imagine George's name being replaced with yours. There are many truths we hold to be self-evident, the world being round and man having just landed on the moon, to name just two. Yet, despite glaring certainty of these things, glaring, underlined, italics, larger, bold, that's what it looks like. For all of them, there exists a contingent of committed contrarians who are certain they know better. The conspiracy theorists. By and large, these ideas are largely harmless, and in fact, the duality of innocuousness and absurdity that they represent can actually make them amusing and quite entertaining. Yeah, normally when we talk about conspiracy theories, I'm entertained. With Holocaust now, you're just like, oh no. No, so many people were killed. Take me, for example. As the professional wind-up merchant that I am, I've lost track of the amount of times that, after a skinful of ale, I've convinced a gullible patron of my local boozer that the world is flat, that the Queen was a lizard person, or my personal favourite, that not only would we not land on the moon, but in fact that the moon just doesn't exist. But while many conspiracy theories are absurd to the point of amusement, some absolutely are not. Take Holocaust denial, for example. Sure, to claim that the Holocaust didn't happen is every bit as absurd as claiming the moon doesn't exist, and yet because of the specifics of this conspiracy, chiefly the fact that to entertain it involves spitting on the graves of 17 million brutally murdered people, to deny it is all the more serious, and frankly, sickening than any of the more light-hearted conspiracy theories out there. This seriousness raises a few questions. Namely, why do people believe that it never happened? If they don't believe it happened, what do they believe happened instead? And lastly, how do they manage to maintain this belief given the enormous, underlined, larger, capitals, bold, italic, basically unrefutable weight of evidence that it did happen? These questions and more I shall answer in the next hour or so as we take a deep dive into the dark, depressing world of Holocaust denial. And it is just the darkest. It's just the darkest. I've been to Auschwitz, and it's just like, it's just, I don't want to even describe. It's just undescribable. The evidence. In my first draft of today's script, I attempted something big-brained, a structure in which I drip-fed you all of the arguments of Holocaust deniers in a vacuum free from counter, the idea being to replicate the conditions in which people come to believe in it, and maybe even briefly tempt you towards it yourself so you can understand how they think, only to let loose a broadside volley of evidence at the end of the video to snap you back into reality, thus giving you a fuller understanding of not only how easy it is to be suckered into Holocaust denial, but also how mad it is. And I agree, I think that's a fantastic structure. However, it is a problem for people who turn off halfway through the video. If we're doing something like moon landing, great. If we're doing something like Holocaust denial, not quite so sure. But after consulting Simon's Discord on the matter, which you should absolutely join, yes, get on there. There'll be a link in the description a little below. There probably won't, but how do you do it? Discord links only last for like 30 days or something absurd, so I'm not really sure how you can join that Discord. But Liam, who is the community manager of the Discord, he'll probably figure it out. I've got to remember to tell him, though. I was made aware that people who click off the video early, why would you do such a thing? Simon makes gold content, you're goddamn right. A golden god! I am untethered and my rage knows no bounds! Just before we continue with the video today, big shout out to today's wonderful sponsor, and that would be Vessi. Vessi makes shoes. They make the only shoes that I wear. Vessi started sponsoring me 2-3 years ago now, and since that time, I think I have worn something other than Vessi shoes on maybe 2 occasions. Vessi makes shoes that look amazing. This is a fresh pair of, these are called the weekend shoes. I had an identical pair of these previously that I wore for 2 years and just wore them consistently. And then after 2 years, because when you wear shoes every day for 2 years, they wear. Bought a new pair because I just love them that much. What Vessi wanted me to tell you about specifically is their Stormburst shoes. These are perfect for spring. All Vessis, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this. This is their big selling point. They're made with something called Dymatex, which makes them 100% waterproof. That's not water resistant. It's not like, I don't know, I've been sold shoes in the past. It's like, oh yeah, just spray on this thing and it makes them like water resistant. That is a crock of S word. Can't swear in my ads, but it's a crock of S word because it never works. With Vessis, you could have it in water up to here. Up to here, to the top of the shoe, and nothing is getting in. It's waterproof like a pair of rain shoes, or Wellington boots, as we'd call them in the UK. These are them in black, these are them in grey, the Stormbursts. I haven't actually worn these yet. I have a beautiful pair of white ones at home that are just like these, except gleaming white. I went to a farm the other day. I got kids. And my wife's like, you have not worn appropriate shoes. And I'm like, oh, haven't I, dear wife? Oh, haven't I? Because they get all muddy, and then I just get back to the car. And I'm just like, you know what I'm going to do? Just wipe these off with a wet wipe from my kids. Like the pushchair thing, you got the wet wipes in there. I just wipe them off and they're as good as new because that's how Vessi works. It's amazing. There's nothing better than Vessi. What you need to do is go to vessi.com/DTU and you'll get an automatic 15% off your first purchase at checkout and you'll be ready rain or shine, won't you? There's nothing better than Vessi. I don't wear anything else. You shouldn't wear anything else either, dear viewer. That's vessi.com/DTU, 15% off. You won't regret it. You'll end up with a cupboard full of Vessi shoes like me because you'll realize they're amazing. And now back to today's video. They might actually accidentally be converted into Holocaust deniers. This was not a notion that sparked joy, and thusly, I opted to kick the video off differently with a chapter in which we firmly get the reality of the matter established before we even mention a single denier's name. So, with that in mind, what is the evidence for the Holocaust? The first is the contemporary documentation, as the Nazis, in an almost stereotypically German fashion, were meticulous about organized record-keeping and keeping the bureaucratic apparatus of genocide neat and tidy. So meticulous was their record-keeping that even after a monumental attempt to shred, burn, and otherwise destroy paperwork when it became obvious that Germany wasn't winning the war, a preposterous amount of documentation survived. What's that movie? Is it the one where they're about the Iran hostage crisis? Fargo? No, that's a different movie or a TV show. Argo, with Matt Damon? Maybe? And they're in the US embassy in Iran, and then they're like breaking in, and they're all like madly throwing shit into incinerators.
Burn everything! Burn it now! All right, burn everything. All the files, file cabinets, safe.
The most damning of these come from the 1942 Wannsee Conference, often referred to as the smoking gun of the Holocaust by scholars. Its surviving documents outline the Nazis' plan to round up Europe's Jews, transport them to occupied Poland, and murder them on an industrial scale. These brutal musings cannot be dismissed as mere planning or wishful thinking either, because after the conference, the rhetoric of Nazi elites got much more genocide-y. For example, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, openly discusses the mass extermination of the Jews in several speeches after the conference, with a notable example being one in Poznan, Poland in October 1943, in which he said, quote, "The Jewish people are going to be exterminated. That's what every party member says. Sure. It's in our program. Elimination of the Jews. Extermination. It'll be done. The wealth they possessed, we took from them. There will be no mercy. We had the moral right. We had the duty towards our people to destroy this people that wanted to destroy us. They wanted to destroy you. Did they? Bell end. Beyond the Wannsee Conference, an array of other evidence survived in paper form. For example, architectural blueprints of Auschwitz concentration camp were discovered, which, thanks to having words printed on them such as gas chambers, crematoria, and bone-crushing machine, made it rather obvious what had been going on there. There are also the personal correspondences between Nazi officials that admit to the Holocaust. A notable example of this would be the Jager Report, written on December 1st, 1941. This details the activities of Einsatzkommando 3, one of the Einsatzgruppen death squads let loose on Eastern Europe following Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June of that year. It records a total of 137,343 executions in areas that are now Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus. The numbers here are just beyond extraordinary. When you think that 9/11 killed 3,000 people, and here we're talking about a tiny fraction of the whole Holocaust, killing 137,343. I feel like just not saying that 343 there is just insane, because that's 343 people. It's just beyond comprehension. Most of the report is just statistics that coldly break this figure down by area and time, but occasionally the report does contain prose and they are chilling to read. To quote, "I can establish today that the goal to solve the Jewish problem for Lithuania has been reached by EK3. There are no Jews anymore in Lithuania, with the exception of the labor Jews and their families." Then there are the various documents that catalogue the forceful transportation of persecuted civilians to the vast network of extermination and concentration camps across the Nazi Empire. These documents included timetables, transportee lists, and even the costs associated with the transportation. An example of this type of evidence would be the Korher Report of 1943, a 16-page report compiled by Dr. Richard Korher, a statistician under Himmler. It was intended to provide him with a sitrep on how the extermination of the Jews was coming along and gives a breakdown of the then over 4 million Jews that had been removed from their homes and transported to camps. In one section alone, while discussing Austria's Jewish population, Korher coldly notes that the nation's Jewish population fell from roughly 220,000 in March 1938 to a mere 8,102 in January 1943, with the population reduction being ascribed to 14,509 Jews who died in the ghettos or working as slave labor, 149,124 who fled Austria before, during, or after the annexation, 47,555 who had been transported to concentration camps, and 710 who had fallen off the radar, presumed to be in hiding. Then, there are the photographs. Some camp personnel took photos as personal keepsakes, such as those found in the Auschwitz album, which chronicles the arrival of Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz in 1944. There are photos taken by the inmates themselves, such as the Sonderkommando photographs of August 1944. There are also Renaissance, I think that should be reconnaissance. I'm like, what is a Renaissance photo? But it's definitely reconnaissance photo taken by the Allied Air Forces, and finally those taken immediately after the camp's liberation. I recommend a brief tangent to look up the Auschwitz album and the Sonderkommando photographs, Simon, as they're the only images we have of the gas chambers in action. It's harrowing stuff. I understand the value of doing that. I also understand that people might be upset if we don't show these photos in the video, but I don't want to do that. So we're not going to do that. I'm not going to look it up. They're not going to be in the video. Sorry. They exist, just to be clear. So vast is the amount of documentary evidence that in total, more than 3,000 tons of it was used as evidence during the Nuremberg trials, and as time goes on, more and more of it surfaces. Photo albums emerge in estate clearances, documents are discovered in the forgotten corners of archives, and so on. Documentary evidence alone proves the Holocaust happened, but it is still only one type of evidence. We also have the testimonies of countless witnesses, the most compelling of which naturally comes from survivors, particularly the Sonderkommandos. These were camp internees, usually Jews, which were forced at gunpoint to aid their own genocide. This gave them a unique perspective of both sides of the fence, so to speak. Unfortunately, since Sonderkommandos were often murdered when their handlers worried that they knew too much, few of their accounts exist. But the ones that do are invaluable. An example would be the Scrolls of Auschwitz, 8 caches of documents found by 5 different Sonderkommandos that were buried near the Auschwitz crematoria in 1944 and later recovered between 1945 and 1980. Their purpose was simple: to make sure that some evidence of Auschwitz's horror survived, lest the Nazi genocide be successfully expunged from history. They contain everything, from numbers killed on specific days to descriptions of life in the ghettos and the deportation process. Then there are the testimonies of the perpetrators, with some being penned at the time and others being retroactive. Contemporary testimony tended to be loud and proud about the Holocaust, the authors believing history would remember them as heroes, and thus being completely unrepentant. I don't understand when you're just murdering civilians on a mass scale, or any scale, that you could think that you're going to be remembered. Although, even if you are remembered as heroes, let's say the Nazis won, you can't think that that's right. An example of this type of testimony would be a letter that was penned by Auschwitz guard Hugo Becher to his wife on January the 28th, 1945, in which he says, "The prisoners were all sick, dirty, and thin as skeletons. All they were good for was to be burned in the Neuengamme crematorium, and a lot of them thought they were being brought to Neuengamme to be burned. Of course, many of them are stupid, primitive people." Testimonies penned retroactively are much more apologetic. Examples of this type include that of Reinhold Hanging, an Auschwitz guard who was put on trial for his crimes in 2016 at the age of 94. After pleading guilty, he said the following: "People were being shot, gassed, and burned. I could see corpses being moved around and off the site. Yes, one was aware of that. I noticed the smell of burning. I knew that corpses were being burned, of course. I found out that trains arrived in Auschwitz crammed full of people. We were aware that the majority of people who arrived in the trains were killed. I am ashamed that I witnessed injustice and allowed it to continue without taking actions against it. Yeah, as you fucking should be, you piece of shit. See what I mean about the change in tone? Yeah, forgive me if I'm not exactly overflowing with Christian forgiveness, viewers. Then there is the material evidence for the Holocaust, chief among which is the camps themselves. Yeah, it's like, I've been there. Still today, they contain ruins of gas chambers and crematoria. They also contain mass graves from the late war massacres of inmates. These particular killings were so hurried and carried out on such a vast scale that the on-site crematorians couldn't keep up. So instead, half-assed efforts to burn bodies outside were made, and they were buried, leaving the remains to later be discovered and serve as evidence. The belongings of inmates were also recovered. Again, we have this evidence thanks to late war desperation. Earlier in the war, belongings of value, everything from shoes to jewelry, was either sent straight into the Nazis' own coffers or back to Germany's civilians to be repurposed. As the Soviets closed in, however, and the Nazis shifted their priority to evidence destroying, this system fell apart, consequently leaving mountains of personal belongings to be discovered. They all clearly belonged to someone at some point, and given the near-empty camps surrounded by mass graves, it didn't exactly take a genius to piece it together. Other mass graves, not the result of camp killings, have also been found across Europe, such as one in Babi Yar, a ravine in Kiev, Ukraine, where over 33,000 Jews were executed in the span of just 2 days in September 1941. Little attempt was made to destroy the bodies before covering them over, consequently leaving the remains as evidence. Similarly, there's also the mass graves left over from the Ponary massacre near Vilnius, Lithuania, where approximately 100,000 Jews and Slavs were executed and dumped into pits, again, with little to no effort being made to destroy their bodies. So then, between documentary evidence, testimonies, and material evidence, the case for the Holocaust being real is truly irrefutable. But there is one final set of evidence that we must consider: maths. Before the war, Jewish communities thrived across the continent, particularly in Eastern Europe, with centuries-old populations boasting rich histories, traditions, and contributions to the societies that they lived in. However, come post-war censuses, millions of people from the Nazis' persecuted groups had vanished from the record. Poland, which had the largest Jewish population in Europe before the war, saw its Jewish population shrink from over 3 million to less than 45,000 by the time of the first post-war census in 1950. In Romania, the numbers shrank from nearly 757,000 to 280,000. In Germany, it was 525,000 to 37,000. In Czechoslovakia, it was reduced from 357,000 to 17,000. These numbers were equally dire in southern Europe, with the Jewish population of Greece falling from 73,000 to 7,000. In Yugoslavia, 70,000 to 3,500. And in Bulgaria, the population fell from 50,000 to 6,500. Now, it is key to stress with these stats that not every lost number equals a death. These figures were compiled a few years after the end of World War II, at which point significant numbers of Jews had emigrated, mostly to either the US or newly founded Israel. But if you remove immigration figures from the numbers, it equates to roughly 6 million Jews, exactly the figure that modern scholars believe died in the Holocaust. So, after that exhaustive exploration into the evidence saying that the Holocaust did happen, I think it's safe to say, or at least I hope it is, that we are all in agreement that the Holocaust absolutely did happen, and that we will now all nicely be protected against the absolute litany of lunacy that will form the rest of the video, and possibly in some of the comments today, because that's the world we live in. So now, let's get into the denial itself. The wartime years. The first Holocaust deniers were the Nazis themselves, as before the war was even over, they were making efforts to cover their tracks and obfuscate the truth. It's critical to understand this foundational denialism, as not only is it a part of the story, but later deniers would use the lies spread by the Nazis as the basis of their own arguments. One of their methods was the use of doublespeak, euphemisms, and coded descriptions, which served to grey the waters around what they were actually up to. You're likely already familiar with at least one example, that being the final solution to the Jewish problem. Of course, we in the modern day are fully aware what was meant by that term, but you can see how, to the contemporary observer, despite its ominous undernotes, it could serve to cast a slight shadow of doubt over the Nazis' true intentions. You also have to remember that anti-Semitism was very common worldwide in that period. Unlike today, where if you took to a podium and started decrying the Jewish problem, you would rightly be laughed off the stage as a nutter, back in those days, you'd likely receive thunderous applause. After all, everyone clapping would have that Jew in their neighborhood, the one with all the money and the funny customs that they didn't attempt to understand. He's a wrong'un, you know, they'd say. He doesn't go to church, opens his shop on a Sunday. Awful he is. This Hitler fellow must be onto something, actually. They'd go on. thus being very susceptible to Nazi doublespeak. Other examples include special treatment, a code word for murder, and resettlement to the east, a code word for forced deportation to ghettos and concentration camps. When considered alongside the casual anti-Semitism that we just discussed, you can see how some people would drink up these terms. For example, special treatment. Well, they need that, don't they? You know, what they're like, is something they would say. And resettlement to the east, which would likely have the anti-Semite saying, "How nice, they're just being resettled. Be glad to be rid of them, to be honest. You know what they're like. Plus, I heard they're going to build them a little town." This use of doublespeak also extended to Action T4, a Nazi program aimed at exterminating the physically and mentally disabled. It killed over 200,000 people and was euphemistically dubbed euthanasia, a term that implied the deaths were consensual and only being done as an act of mercy to help poor, broken people go out on their own terms with some dignity. In reality, consent was never sought, mercy never considered, and they were simply killed for being an affront to the Nazi vision of a pure society. Alright, so now that you've all got a good grasp on how Nazi doublespeak worked, let's put your learnings to the test. I'll present you some Nazified language, and you can try and filter the nonsense out of it and deduce the actual meaning of the term, starting with enhanced interrogation. Well, that's one we know from today, because they still use it. It's torture. Yep, it's an easy one. Torture. How about night and fog? I'm not going to pause here for too long to keep the video moving, but I don't know. This one's a bit trickier. It refers to a dissident who is made to disappear in the middle of the night, literally vanishing into the night and fog, okay? There's another easy one to finish off, cleansing. Well, that's going to be extermination, isn't it? I suspect most of you got this one, extermination, but it is worse than it first appears. The Nazis believed that what they deemed lesser races, i.e. the Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, etc., were literally of dirty blood, so by killing them, they were cleaning the human gene pool. Jesus. In addition to the use of obfuscating language, the Nazis also attempted to destroy material evidence to cover their tracks. It's not exactly someone who's innocent, something they do, is it? Mass destruction of evidence. We already touched on this a bit in the last chapter, but let's go into a bit more depth now. Oftentimes, evidence destruction was on a small scale, an SS officer ordering his men to pull their officers apart and hurl everything into a furnace before surrendering, for example. But other times, orders to do so came from the very top. An example of this would be the Sonderaktion 1005, spanning from June 1942 to late 1944. This was an order aimed at obliterating evidence of the many, many mass murders committed in occupied Poland. It was issued by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Nazi secret police forces, and its execution proved most grim. Sonderkommandos, dubbed corpse units for this task, were taken from the camps, shackled, forced to exhume mass graves, and incinerate the bodies at gunpoint. Good lord. This task done, the corpse units were then often shot and incinerated themselves to make sure that word of the mass graves never got out. Eventually, industrial incinerators proved unable to keep up with the amount of bodies being exhumed, and so new techniques were tried, ranging from bombing the mass graves with incendiary weapons to building elaborate burning pyres constructed using alternating layers of corpses and firewood arranged in an intricate lattice to ensure efficient burning. Like rats frantically trying to scurry from a sinking ship, there was truly no depth the Nazis would not fall to save themselves. Cover-ups were also attempted at concentration camps. At Auschwitz, for example, with the Soviets looming ever closer, the SS began evacuating the camp in 1944, forcing the already weak and emaciated prisoners to endure long, grueling marches westward in the biting cold. Those unable to keep pace or who collapsed from fatigue were summarily shot. In total, more than 60,000 people were forced on these death marches, every one of them, one less testimony, able to be delivered to the Soviets when they liberated their camp. The SS also attempted to destroy the death apparatuses of the camp. At Auschwitz, for example, they razed the gas chambers and crematoria using dynamite. Fortunately, while they may have succeeded, the litany of documents and prisoners that the bumbling SS failed to destroy allowed the reconstruction of these facilities perfectly. Also, remember this detail about parts of Auschwitz being reconstructed. It'll be important later. Oh god, we're not going to get into it's fake because they rebuilt it. It was never there in the first place. Not quite, really. Similar cover-up attempts were also made at Treblinka extermination camp. The camp, standout for being one of only 6 pure extermination camps, operated between July 1942 and November 1943, during which time up to 900,000 people met their end there. Following an uprising by its inmates, in which every single one of them was killed by the SS, the decision was made to erase all evidence of its existence. To this end, it was meticulously dismantled, with buildings being torn down and bodies being destroyed and the area being leveled. So extreme was the attempted cover-up that the Nazis even built an expansive and fully functional farm on the site, planting crops and erecting a litany of structures, just to really sell the impression that this land was naught but a farm. A Ukrainian soldier was even sent there with his family, being told that the farm was a reward for exemplary service to the nation it defected to. The Nazis also conducted counter-propaganda efforts as the world began to wise up as to what they were up to, with the go-to tactic being to have their foreign collaborators broadcast and proclaim that the stories of atrocities were naught but a shoddy attempt at tugging at the heartstrings to make listeners happy to send their young men off to slaughter in foreign fields. An example of this kind of propaganda would be William Joyce, better known by his broadcast moniker of Lord Haw-Haw, a British defector to Germany. He made broadcasts right till the end of the war. Oh, I hope he got killed. That'd be nice. But such efforts were just the tip of the iceberg, as the Nazis also regularly invited international aid organizations to both the camps and the ghettos to conduct inspections. Naturally, the visiting officials weren't exactly given a normal glimpse into life at these places, and every effort was made to dress them up and make them appear as wholesome as could be. For example, the Danish and International Red Cross were invited to inspect the Theresienstadt ghetto in 1944, and before their arrival, the Nazis made sure to clear up the waste, the debris, and of course, the corpses, before they then gave the place a lick of paint, planted some flowers here and there, and told the interns inside to put on nice big smiles, lest they get machine-gunned after the inspection. Shockingly, this worked, with a report filed afterwards claiming words to the extent, "Sure, it's a bit naughty locking all of these Jews up, but they're so well looked after. I mean, what are you going to do? It could be worse." They also pulled this trick at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1940 when they invited the International Red Cross to inspect it. I feel like International Red Cross, if you're getting invited to inspect something, go to the place next door. Because if you're getting invited to inspect something, it's probably going to be okay. Here, the deception went even further than at Theresienstadt. The whole place was cleaned. The cobbled-together wooden cots that filled the accommodation blocks were replaced with proper bunk beds topped with sprung mattresses. The buildings were given a coat of paint to brighten them up, and sham facilities were set up, including shops, canteens, and even a school. Again, this worked a treat, with the takeaway opinion of the Red Cross being one of, quote, "Well, we don't like that they're locking up all of these minorities, but they're treating them so well, so who are we to quibble?" Naturally, once they left, all of these nice new amenities were immediately ripped out. Again, don't go to the ones you're invited to. It's like, sure, come and inspect my country for nuclear weapons. Don't look behind that door. You gotta look behind that door, guys. Come on. The Nazis also produced film propaganda to tell the world that all was well within its ghettos and camps. A notable example of this type of production is the movie The Fuhrer Gives a City to the Jews. Focusing on the Theresienstadt ghetto, it portrayed it as an almost resort for Jews, showcasing staged scenes of cultural events, sports, and other leisure activities. Tragically, once filming was complete, the majority of the cast, along with the filmmaker, were transported to Auschwitz and eventually executed. Thankfully, the Nazi Empire wasn't to last. The Thousand-Year Reich managed to survive barely 12 years until Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin in 1945 and ended Hitler's reign, and with it, the Holocaust. This too ended the Nazis' foundational denialism, but it wouldn't be long until the baton was picked up by another. Early Holocaust denial. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, the world struggled to grasp the sheer scale and horror of the Holocaust. It's like I said, compare those numbers. You don't want to. It's bad to compare tragedies to tragedies, but the numbers are just vast. While the brutalities of war were well known, the systematic extermination of some 17 million people purely because of their arbitrary innate characteristics was simply too much for some to comprehend and accept. Consequently, many of the initial reports were met with a mix of disbelief and skepticism. Fair enough. Early days, you'd be like, nah, that's not possible. No one would do that. That's insane. Please, get me some evidence, and then I'll believe. I would be that person. I'd be like, show me the evidence. But then when they show me the fucking evidence, I'll be like, okay, cool. Got it. Shit. That really happened. And frankly, if we're being honest, you can get why some people would think this. Sure, in the modern day, we're all very aware of the horrific crimes against humanity that the Nazis committed, and so to us, this notion that someone wouldn't believe it sounds ridiculous. I don't think it sounds ridiculous. I think it's like nothing like that had happened before. No genocide on that scale. So it would be hard to believe. But put yourself in the shoes of an ordinary civilian immediately after the war. The information age is a long, long way away, and so all of your knowledge of the world comes from one place, state-controlled wartime media, which by and large hasn't committed much prince-based Nazi atrocities, and so when information starts to be released, you're blindsided. It takes you completely by surprise. Millions dead in camps, roaming death squads, industrialized genocide. It's a hell of a thing to claim, and to many, it seemed ridiculous. The notion that humanity could fall so low as to do something so horrific. I mean, surely not. As a result, many simply didn't believe it to begin with. Another source of early denial, particularly among those who were middle-aged and older, was their younger experiences with wartime propaganda. During World War I, the Allies had spread atrocity stories to demonize the Central Powers, especially Germany. Among these stories was the infamous German corpse factory tale. This piece of propaganda falsely claimed that Germany was boiling down human corpses to extract fats for various wartime uses, such as soap or munitions. By the time World War II began, this particular story had been thoroughly debunked and was widely acknowledged as a fabrication. Therefore, when stories about Nazi atrocities began to hit the headlines, many had the response of, here we go again, more outlandish stories to rile us up to hate the Germans. These immediate forms of denial were very widespread, with millions of people buying into them in one way or the other, be it simply entertaining them or fully endorsing them. But mercifully, while they were incredibly prolific, they were also short-lived. The fact that they were rooted in a genuine ignorance of reality, rather than any considered reality, meant that they were very easy to dispel and root out. Every new story printed, every new picture published, every new testimony broadcast took an axe to the timber of this denial, and come the very heavily broadcast Nuremberg trials in 1946, the whole tree had come falling down, and the public at large had no doubts that the Holocaust had happened. But unfortunately, that was far from the end, because a few short years later, the real nutters began to strike. Yeah, so far, these people aren't conspiracy theorists, they're just waiting for evidence. Fair play. The real pieces of shit are coming. These were the thinkers, and boy do I hate having to describe them as that, who looked into the absolute litany of evidence that we outlined in the last chapter and said, nah, I think I know better than all that tosh. Didn't happen, did it? I'm a big-brained contrarian. The true, unabashed, as we would imagine them today, Holocaust deniers. The very first of these considered deniers was French journalist Maurice Bardèche. Coincidentally, he was also an open fascist, not that biased him at all. Oh no. He had simply conducted an objective assessment of the facts and by pure coincidence just happened to arrive at a conclusion that completely excused his ideology of any wrongdoing. How handy. And here's me, who spent my whole life changing my opinions to fit reality. Why haven't I just been changing reality to fit my opinions? Then I'd literally never have to think or be wrong about anything ever again. Yeah, Jesus Christ, Bardèche, what the f***? Bardèche outlined his perspective in his 1948 book, Nuremberg, or the Promised Land. His arguments were characterized by attempts to sow doubt, discredit witnesses, and shift the blame. For example, he claimed that survivor testimonies were unreliable because they predominantly came from Jewish or communist sources. Furthermore, he also claimed that the atrocities that took place in the camps were the handiwork of the prisoners themselves, particularly the Sonderkommandos, who he claimed willingly sold out their fellow inmates for extra rations and privileges. Even if they did, they're not the fucking ones responsible. He also implied that the conditions in the camps deteriorated only after Germany began facing military setbacks. A final notable claim of his was that the only thing gassed in Auschwitz were lice. His basis of this claim being that Zyklon B, the gas employed by the Nazis, was invented as a delouser and a disinfecting agent. Technically, he wasn't incorrect. Zyklon B's patent, originally awarded in 1926, does indeed quote that Zyklon B is extremely useful for combating all kinds of insects. But ultimately, I feel this is a bit of a swing and a miss for old Bardèche because he overlooks one teeny tiny little fact. The radical notion that sometimes, if you're feeling really adventurous, you can use something for a reason that it wasn't invented for. Mind-blowing stuff, right? I can only assume, were I to pick up a golf club and swing it into his head several times. Bardèche wouldn't consider this murder because, after all, you can only ever use an object for the reason it's intended. And last I checked, skull cracking is an illegal move in golf. That is beautifully put. Someone who I'm convincingly, someone who I am increasingly, that's the word I'm looking for, convinced is George. Thankfully, even at the time, Bardèche's ideas were rejected by most scholars and the public, who by and large, it says by and large, consider him something of a nutter. I wonder how they got that impression. Tragically, however, his work would find resonance among certain far-right groups and individuals, and later Holocaust deniers would use his work as a springboard, oh god, here we go, drawing inspiration from it and going on to further refine his arguments. Another notable early denier was Harry Elmer Barnes. Unlike Bardèche, Barnes was actually a proper historian, having completed a PhD in history at Columbia University in 1918, and then being employed as a professor at both Clark University and later Smith College. He was always a bit out there with his early work, which focused primarily on the outbreak of World War I, always being very pro-German. For example, in his 1926 book, The Genesis of World War, he argued that the war was a result of a Franco-Russian plot to destroy Germany. But while this work's perfectly valid scholarship, it's not a perspective I would endorse personally, but he was at least using primary sources to build a coherent argument. Come World War II, however, Barnes really went off the deep end. He abandoned all sense of academic rigor in his work and instead allowed his Germanophilia to morph into full-on Nazi apologism and anti-Semitism. He began to go on mad tirades, decrying all efforts to stop Nazi expansionism as warmongering, and claimed that those who countered his perspective were, quote, part of a plot of the Jews and the Anti-Defamation League to intimidate any American historian who proposed to tell the truth about the causes of the war. Bro, you're an academic. Do it properly. Come on, you gotta do better than this. No one's publishing that shit. Naturally, his career began to fall apart because of this. Yes. And by 1940, he had been fired from Smith College and had his column in the New York World Telegram newspaper axed. Good, as he deserves. Because he's making up history. Like every good conspiracy theorist, however, Barnes lacked any accountability for his own actions and instead decried his ever-growing pariah status as being the result of MI6, JP Morgan, and all of the Jewish department store owners in New York City working in league against him. Come the end of World War II, with his life utterly in ruin, good, Barnes only continued to descend further and further down the anti-Semitic rabbit hole, not having much just drunk the Kool-Aid at this point, but basically bathed in it. Highlights of his post-war career include claiming that the expulsion of ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia and Poland following the Soviet takeover was worse than the Holocaust. Dude, you got no perspective. The very same Holocaust, he would argue in the next breath, didn't happen, arguing that even if the Holocaust did happen, the Allies did worse crimes anyway, so don't worry about it. Spoiler, they didn't. Proclaiming that there were no death camps, only concentration camps, and that these camps never used gas chambers or intentionally killed Jews. I must have imagined all of those Zyklon B-stained concrete boxes I've seen on my visits to camps. Yes. Claiming that the Einsatzgruppen, the death squads we discussed earlier, did not in fact kill millions of civilians. It were in fact just an anti-partisan unit that never intentionally killed civilians. Those thousands upon thousands of documents that evidence the Einsatzgruppen, you ask? Well, don't know about that one. Dude, this is crazy. Barnes never worked in serious academia again, but tried ever so hard to maintain the facade of a legitimate historian as he continued to push his mad ideas. Bro, when you've been fired from the university and they've taken away your regular publishing place, no one wants you anymore. No one wants you. He just about managed to put food on the table and the wolves from the door by self-publishing various Holocaust-denying books and by willingly submitted himself to surprisingly well-paying gotcha hit interviews with journalists from time to time. He also became something of a mentor to the next generation of Holocaust deniers, passing on his distorted interpretations and deceitful rhetoric to a new era of individuals who, despite the overwhelming evidence, continue to question and deny the realities of the Holocaust. So now, let's bring this chapter to a close and look at them. Modern denialism. Barnes's greatest protege was one David Hagen. Hagen first came onto the scene in 1961 when he published his first book, The Forced War. First published in West Germany, the book was heavily edited by Barnes and attempted to portray Nazi Germany as a victim of so-called Anglo-Polish conspiracy. But it wasn't just the origins of World War II that Hagen sought to reinterpret. He also attempted to downplay or outright justify the anti-Semitic actions of the Nazis prior to the war. One of his more bold arguments, underlined all caps, bold and italics, was his defense of the massive 1 billion Reichsmark fine levied against the entire Jewish community in Germany after Kristallnacht. Hagen framed this punitive measure as a justifiable response to prevent so-called Jewish profiteering. Most egregiously, he outright denied that any Jews were killed that night, in direct contradiction to records that confirmed the murder of 91 Jews during the violent pogrom. Hagen then doubled down on his Holocaust denial with his 1969 publication, The Myth of the 6 Million. Is someone actually publishing these, or is he self-publishing these out of his basement? Maybe his mum's basement. Shockingly, unlike Barnes, whose post-war work was entirely self-published, Hagen managed to... There we go, George answering my question for me. Hagen managed to find a publisher for this, Noontide Press, a niche publisher known for its anti-Semitic content. Well, there you go, because that exists. Probably not in Germany, though. This sadly was, and to some extent still is, a thing. A whole litany of small-scale publishers popped up around this time to publish anti-Semitic and otherwise toxic and untouchable works. The work itself was filled with trickery, misrepresentation, and an intentional distortion of the facts. For example, he cites the memoirs of Benedikt Kautsky, an Austrian who was imprisoned at Buchenwald and later Auschwitz, who wrote, "I should now like to briefly refer to the gas chambers. Though I did not see them myself, they have been described to me by so many trustworthy people that I have no hesitation in reproducing their testimony." Well, yeah. Why? If he says why didn't he see them himself, I'll be like, well, because if he saw them himself, he'd be dead, wouldn't he? In The Myth of the 6 Million, this passage became, "I should now like to briefly refer to the gas chambers. I did not see them myself." So, dude, you need to, when you're taking a quote and changing it, you need to make it clear that you're changing the quote. And just because I'm reading this, and maybe put it on the screen, whoever's editing this, so people can see how it's written. He's not using the the dot dot dot. Is that an ellipsis? What's that called where you have the dot dot dot, in between a quote to show that you broke it up to adjust not its meaning, which is not okay, but adjust the organization of the quote. This was Hoggan's method, bastardizing legitimate sources to create a counter-explanation. You can see how this would be effective too, if your only knowledge of history came from TV documentaries and whatever you picked up in school, and one of Hoggan's books found its way to you, it would seem very believable. After all, he cites an absolute litany of sources, so how could he be wrong? It's only with deeper understanding that one is actually able to counter his points and realize that he was no historian, just an absolute nutter wearing the skin of a historian in an attempt to, for whatever reason, publish falsehoods and incorrect history. Another notable Holocaust denier, sometimes I get the label, someone will be like, YouTube historian, it's like, bro, no, I am not a historian, I am an entertainer. I bring you entertainment, well-researched entertainment, but I make no a claim of being a historian or an academic or anything like that, so steady on. Another notable Holocaust denier of this era is Frenchman Paul Rasseneur. He's notable for two reasons. Firstly, his impact was so great that he's often dubbed the father of Holocaust denial by credible historians, and secondly, he was a Holocaust survivor himself. Bruh, what? Yes, you heard me right, folks. The father of Holocaust denial was a Holocaust survivor. We literally couldn't make this up. What? How? It gets weirder still, because not only was he a Holocaust survivor, but he was also a member of the resistance and spent the first 3 years of the occupation printing and distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. What, did he grow a brain tumor or something? What the fuck happens? Producing false identity papers and smuggling people to safety. He was eventually arrested on October the 30th, 1943, after which he was tortured to the point of suffering permanent debilitating injuries and then sent to Buchenwald and later Auschwitz concentration camps, where he spent the remainder of the war as a slave laborer in historic conditions. Bro, you must have got a brain tumor. What has happened in your brain? His Holocaust denial began immediately upon his return to France in 1945. He began working as a teacher and immediately found himself reluctant to share the many stories of German wartime brutality that found their way into his curriculum. To him, they were gross misrepresentations of reality. The horrors described simply did not reflect his lived experience, at least as he remembered it. This was reflected in his first book, Crossing the Line, account of his own experience in Buchenwald that was published in 1949. At the time, it was praised as being an objective account, one that removed the emotions of resentment and hatred, and instead just focused on providing a simple, to-the-point account of his experiences. Wait, this sounds good, but what happens? With hindsight, however, we know that such a perspective of his first work couldn't be further from the truth, and that for whatever reason, what he had compiled was a carefully curated and edited account that specifically removed the worst of the brutality from the story. The huge question is why? This became clear with the publication of his second book, The Lie of Ulysses, A Glance at Literature of Concentration Camp Inmates, in 1950. Here he took aim at his fellow survivors, pointing out supposed falsehoods and exaggerations in their accounts. This work was rather controversial to say the least, but on account of him being an actual Holocaust survivor, he was spared the public demonization that had fallen on the likes of Barnes and Badesh. He then decided to lay off the denial for some time and slipped back into the life of a normal, or respected, quotations, academic. For a while anyway, because with the coming of modern denialism with the likes of Hoggan, he was inspired to pay no heed to his detractors, pick his pen back up and jump on the denial train. I just have a screaming question in my mind of why? Why? He would publish a total of 4 more books denying the Holocaust. And it's like, okay, so the normal reason, if it's like aliens built the pyramids, I'm like money, because people like money, and by writing books about nonsense, they can get them published, people will buy them because they think they're facts, even though they're fiction, they'll sell more books, and they'll make tons of money. But I literally can't believe that someone would sell out that hard. That would be insane. Ulysses Betrayed His Own in 1961, The True Eichmann Trial or The Incorrigible Victors in 1962, The Drama of the European Jews in 1964, and Those Responsible for the Second World War in 1967. He also wrote hundreds of smaller articles. The arguments presented are all the usual talking points that we now associate with Holocaust denial. 6 million is an exaggerated figure. There were no death camps, only concentration camps. The Holocaust was made up by Jews to get sympathy for Israeli statehood. Documents evidencing the Holocaust are all forgeries or out of context. Bro, no one's that prolific at forgery. Ultimately, come the time of his death in 1967, yay! Ratner was a complete pariah. The previous leniency had been afforded as a survivor of the Holocaust himself had been pushed too far, and scholars, fellow survivors, and the wider public had all come together to decide to treat him with the same disdain as every other Holocaust denier. He died, ironically, of damage to his kidneys sustained during his torture by the Nazis. This is why I can't believe he'd sell out. He was literally tortured and put in Auschwitz. The very brutality that had spent his career denying. Another thinker worth taking note of from this time is Austin App. He too, like Barnes, was a respected... Why? I still don't know why this dude did it. Why would he deny this stuff when he was in it? Why? Anyway, back to Austin App. He too, like Barnes, was a respected academic before he drank the Kool-Aid. He served as the head of the English department at the University of Scranton between 1935 and 1942 and produced serious scholarly works such as Lancelot in English Literature, His Role and Character, published in 1929, and Edward Arlington Robinson's Arthurian Poems, published in 1935. For him, the transformation from respected scholar to Holocaust-denying nutter is pretty well documented. He was a vocal isolationist prior to World War II and refused to change his position, or at least keep it quiet, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. After many, many warnings to think about his mortgage and just keep his mouth shut, he was eventually fired in 1942. Then, with his life in turmoil, his isolationist principles slowly began to morph into sympathetic ideas, and he joined the Federation of American Citizens of German Descent, a heritage organization which at that point became completely overrun by Nazi sympathizers. Here he got exposed to Nazi sentiments properly for the first time, and for whatever reason, he liked what he heard. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't feel like "for whatever reason" is an appropriate phrase there. Yeah, it's like, if from the modern perspective, we're like, yeah, that's crazy. But Hitler and the Nazis persuaded an entire nation. He's just one dude. They persuaded a nation. And when they're like, we're the best, you're Aryan, everyone is secondary to you. If you're like insecure and a little bitch, then you're going to really like that. Whatever his name was, Amy App or whatever. Oh, little bitch. He was then elected president of the Federation in 1945, at which point he was beyond the point of no return, a considered and committed neo-Nazi. From this point on, he began applying this neo-Nazi in 1945. From this point on, he began applying his skills and he'd acquired in his past life as a respected scholar, and began pumping out printed works denying the Holocaust, with notable titles including Ravishing the Women of Conquered Europe, published in 1948. A Straight Look at the Third Reich, Hitler and National Socialism, How Right, How Wrong, published in 1974, The 6 Million Swindle, Blackmailing the German People for Hard Marks with Fabricated Corpses, published in 1976, The Curse of Anti-Semitism, also published in 1976. But for App, the books he published were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to his influence. After all, plenty of Holocaust deniers have produced books that have gone on to indoctrinate people to their nutty beliefs that alone wouldn't earn him a place on this who's who of the most important and influential deniers. So, why have I included him? Well, that would be for inspiring the creation for the Institute of Historical Review, the IHR, in 1978. Founded by David McCalden, a leading member of the British neo-fascist National Front Party, and Willis Carto, an American pro-segregation activist, after a meeting with App, the IHR was, and tragically still is, a US-based think tank that focuses on the proliferation and promotion of Holocaust denial, and if you wish to have a well-fleshed-out understanding of Holocaust denial, it is critical that you understand the IHR, because like an anti-Semitic octopus, it has spread its tentacles throughout the world, all with the aim of spreading Holocaust denial, an aim that, sadly, it has been very successful at. Yeah, and when it's called the Institute for Historical Review, it sounds very legitimate. Like, it's reviewing history is a great idea. Like, when we write history, we should go back and check that we wrote it right, because with modern sentiments and new evidence, we should often be reviewing history. But they've just given it like a legitimate name for something that is totally illegitimate. Before the IHR, Holocaust deniers were disparate and disorganized, with authors publishing their work in isolation, rarely holding public events, and having little interaction with their readers beyond the occasional superfan that would go out of their way to get in touch, as we saw with Barnes and Hoggen. They changed this through their Revisionist Convention, a yearly conference first held in 1979, to which they invited everyone in the world of Holocaust denial. The big names we've mentioned in this video, small and more obscure authors, promising up-and-comers, and the public. Anyone and everyone with an interest in Holocaust denial was welcome. The conventions themselves were, and we're able to speak in the past tense here because thankfully the conventions no longer run, excellent, exactly what you'd expect them to be. Talk after talk by leading Holocaust deniers, each taking their hour in the pulpit to reel off their bastardized statistics, out of context quotes, and deranged pontifications to thunderous applause. Yeah, it's basically just a giant circle jerk, isn't it? But while it was no doubt gratifying for the participants to finally be hearing some applause for a change, these presentations on paper, the whole point of the event, were actually only a secondary purpose. The real purpose of these conventions took place in the evening in the bar of whatever shady two-bit hotel could be corralled into hosting the event, because here the world's leading Holocaust deniers were able to freely talk to one another, get their ideas into lockstep with one another, and conspire for further real-world events and occasions that would help expose Holocaust denial to more and more people. The thing about the two-bit hotel, right? I don't know, man. Like, if I imagine myself as the manager of the hotel, it's like, oh, the International Society for whatever it was, Institute for Historical Review. I mean, that sounds like a boring group of academics. Sure, you can host it in the hotel, and is it even worth a Google? I get messages from, potential sponsors and think tanks, not often, but occasionally, right? And they've got some perspective on something, and maybe they're interested in sponsoring or whatever. And I'd get something from the Institute of Historical Review, and I'd be like, oh, okay, sounds interesting. What are you going on about? And I'm sure it would be very subtly played. Like, they'd be very careful about it. They'd be very, masked. And I'd look into it, and then I'd very quickly find out that it was, just basically Nazis. But I see how people would, because it's got a veneer of legitimacy to it. It's a think tank. It's got a great name. Furthermore, it also gave a fantastic opportunity for the leading lights of Holocaust denial to groom the next generation, who were sold enough on the idea to be willing to shell out the cost of a flight to attend, could be patted on the back by their favorite authors, taken under their wing, and given lots of guidance about how they should proceed in the future. After the first convention, the IHR also launched the Journal of Historical Review, a pseudo-academic journal that served two purposes. Firstly, providing an academic-looking veneer to Holocaust denial that could be used to give the ideas more legitimacy in the public eye, and secondly, to circumvent the inability to publish papers that many Holocaust deniers had found over the years. Books were one thing. They could be self-published or published by small companies sympathetic to the cause, such as Noontide Press, but papers, they were a whole other matter altogether, as no reputable journal would even consider them for publication. The IHR, surprisingly flush with cash thanks to a few wealthy donors, would also sponsor the up-and-comers of Holocaust denial. Say you were a youngster who's just finished reading The 6 Million Swindle, and after finding the ideas presented mostly agreeable, you wanted to do your part to wake up the sheeple of the world to this most egregious lie. Well, what would you do? Go to the university and pursue a traditional academic career, only to have those indoctrinated mainstream historians sabotage you by tanking every paper you write? Work yourself to death trying to produce a book in your spare time while working another full-time job to pay your bills, all in the hopes that your first book would be a hit sufficient enough to devote yourself full-time to racism?
I hear you're a racist now, Father. What? How did you get interested in that type of thing?
While following the foundation of the IHR, you wouldn't have to worry at all. All you had to do was write a lovely little letter to McColden and Cato, and you'd probably find yourself not only with an immediate book deal, but probably a tidy little advance to cover your expenses to help your Holocaust-denying career take off with all possible haste. So, now that I'd feel like I'd apply for that, then write the most sarcastic ever, send it across and be like, thanks for the advance, and fuck you. Sue me, bitch. So, now that you know the full extent to which the IHR promoted Holocaust denial, it will probably come as no surprise to learn that the 80s proved to be something of a renaissance for it, with the numbers of people entertaining and believing the ideas reaching numbers that had not been seen since those immediate few months after World War II. So now, let's bring this chapter to a close and move on to look at what that looked like. The kickback against mainstream Holocaust denial. Thanks to the IHR, many notable Holocaust deniers began to emerge in the 1980s, but most of these can be summed up as wrote a few mad books, made a load of money, lived out their life a rich pariah. Let's not waste any time reviewing them, and let's instead jump the story forward a bit, because while the 1980s might have been the time that Holocaust denial attempted to go mainstream, it is also the time that serious kickback against it began. Prior to this point, most ramifications for Holocaust deniers were social. They would be expelled from universities, fired from their jobs, and otherwise ostracized from polite society, but they wouldn't find themselves in legal trouble. That changed in the 80s, big time, as deniers began finding themselves in the dock. In France, it was when Robert Farison, an academic, was convicted and fined for denying the existence of gas chambers in Nazi camps in his 1980 book In Defense of Memory. Farison's denial, both in his book and in his public speeches, directly violated French laws that protected the integrity of the Holocaust, and he was given a 3-month suspended sentence and a 21,000 franc fine. Following the case in France, Canada also confronted Holocaust denial when Ernst Zundel faced trial in 1984 for publishing the pamphlet Did 6 Million Really Die? The proceedings, dubbed the Great Holocaust Trial, saw Zundel handed a 15-month custodial sentence. Nice. Custodial means you're in prison, right? That's a good time, although he'll probably find his gang to join, won't he? The Nazis. Next, it was West Germany, as Otto Ernst Remmer, a former Wehrmacht officer, was fined in 1985 for distributing pamphlets and delivering speeches that openly denied the Holocaust, actions that constitute a clear violation of West Germany's Volksverhetzung law. He was sent to prison for 22 months. Nice. Then, in a groundbreaking move in 1988, France saw its first revocation of a doctoral degree based on the thesis content, when Henry Roch's words, which audaciously questioned the existence of gas chambers in Nazi concentration camps, sparked widespread public outrage. Building on this, France then first... I know it's obviously worse to go to prison than have your doctorate revoked, but it's still you worked on that for years. If you got a doctorate, you wanted a doctorate bad, man, because it's that's a lot of effort. I know people with doctorates, they work hard for that shit, and he got it taken away for being a dick. Building on this, France then further solidified its legal framework against Holocaust denial in 1989 with the enactment of the Gesetz law. This legislation made it a criminal offense to dispute the reality of crimes against humanity as they were defined under the London Charter of 1945, which had previously provided the foundation for the Nuremberg trials. But then we get the big one, the most widely publicized and most impactful Holocaust denial prosecution of all, that of David Irving. In this video, the only deniers we are analyzing in depth are those who are important to the story of denial, those whose ideas and actions actually progress the narrative, and not just the biggest nutters with the maddest takes. And in that regard, if you remember just one name from today's video, let it be David Irving's, because no other person alone has had such an impact upon Holocaust denial, both in advancing it as a discipline and in shaping the public's perception of it. David Irving himself, like so many others we have discussed, began his career as a legitimate and respected historian, before going off the deep end and making a pariah of himself. Following the failed attempts to complete an undergraduate degree at both Imperial College London and University College London, Irving fled to West Germany to avoid conscription, where he learned German and attempted to have another crack at being a historian, but this time as a popular historian, one who does not publish peer-reviewed academic works. Yeah, I'm not a historian, I'm not even a popular historian, but if I am anything, it's my, it's... just making some popular history stuff. This time he found success with his first book, The Destruction of Dresden, which he published in 1963, being a roaring success both critically and commercially. At the time, a great debate was occurring regarding the morality of carpet bombing during World War II, and Irving's work, which focused very much on the humans on the receiving end of the tactic, was deemed a valuable perspective. Yeah, this seems like a legitimate, and I can see why this book would be successful. It's an interesting topic to talk about. He then published 7 more works between 1964 and 1973, which again were all decent enough histories, but his 9th work, Hitler's War, was published in 1977, and that was when it all started to get just a bit mad. Hitler's War, in a nutshell, was an attempt to rehabilitate the reputation of Hitler by distancing him from the Holocaust and attempting to build a believable layer of separation between him and the genocide. This naturally went down rather badly. Isn't this dude living in Germany? It's definitely not okay. And in his next 19 works, published between 1978 and 2020, he only continued to fall further and further down the rabbit hole of denial. To summarize this intellectual fall, let's now have a look at some of the choice quotes from over the years. Here we go. Quote, "Without Hitler, the state of Israel probably would not exist today. To that extent, he was probably the Jews' greatest friend." Quote, "I don't think there was overall any Reich policy to kill the Jews. If there was, they would have been killed, and there would not have been so many millions of survivors." I don't even know what to say to that one. Quote, "The Holocaust is something like a religion. The intellectual adventure is that we are reversing this entire trend with the space of one generation, that in a few years' time, no one will believe this particular legend anymore. They will say, as I do, that atrocities were committed. Yes, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, but there were no factories of death. All that is a blood libel against the German people." Quote, "The Jews are the architects of their own misfortune." Finally, quote, "And I don't see any reason to be tasteful about Auschwitz. It's baloney. It's a legend. Once..." It's there, dude. It's still there. The quote continues, "Once we admit the fact that it was a brutal slave labor camp and large numbers of people did die as large numbers of innocent people died elsewhere in the war, why believe the rest of the baloney? Bro, because of the overwhelming amount of evidence, maybe. Maybe that. Clown." And this brings us nicely to the point where we first introduced David Irving, his prosecutions for Holocaust denial. His first brush with the law came in 1989 when Austrian authorities issued a warrant for his arrest following 2 speeches he made in the country in which he called for an end to the gas chambers fairy tale, claimed that Hitler had helped Europe's Jews, and that the Holocaust was a myth. This warrant sat gathering dust for 16 years until Irving was stupid enough to enter Austria, at which point he was arrested and served 13 months in prison. Germany and Austria, you must have an extradition thing. Go get that. He's right next door. Go get him. It's 13 months in prison. Then in 1992, a German court found him violating the Volksverhetzung, the law we discussed earlier, and in absentia, he was banned from entering Germany. That same year, he was banned from Australia for similar reasons. Then in 1994, he served 10 days in prison for contempt of court during a Holocaust-related case. But these are all just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to David Irving's brushes with the law, with his most prominent incident being when he sued Penguin Books and American historian Deborah Lipstadt for libel in a case that would come to be known as Irving and Penguin Books Limited. The case arose after Lipstadt's book, Denying the Holocaust, characterized Irving as a Holocaust denier and accused him of distorting historical facts. I wonder if he's going to sue us for libel. In my opinion. The trial commenced in January 2000 and lasted several weeks. The defense's strategy was not only to defend the claims made in Lipstadt's book, but also to prove that Irving had indeed manipulated historical evidence to support his pro-Nazi views. The court examined Irving's work and concluded that he had persistently and deliberately misrepresented and manipulated historical evidence. Moreover, the judge found that Irving was an active Holocaust denier, anti-Semite, and racist who associated with right-wing extremists promoting neo-Nazism. In April 2000, the judgment was delivered against Irving. The court ruled that Lipstadt's depiction of Irving in her book was true, and that the defense had proven Irving to be one of the most dangerous spokespersons for Holocaust denial. Irving was ordered to pay substantial legal costs, a financial blow that led to his bankruptcy. Oh no! He's got no money left! What a crying shame! After this point, David Irving slipped into irrelevancy. He continued to pump out books, his latest being published in 2020, but in a nutshell, nobody cares. He never appears on TV anymore. Is he still alive? He never appears on TV anymore, not even as a figure to point your finger at and laugh. No one listens to what he has to say anymore, not even so that they can mock or deride him, and his footprint as a figure in society has all but evaporated. The fate of David Irving, who was litigated into obscurity and ostracized from respectable discourse, epitomizes the ultimate trajectory of most deniers of his generation. The legal system, wielded by those determined to preserve the sanctity of historical truth, has left individuals like him financially and socially depleted. His descent from a once respected author to a fringe figure self-publishing to a minuscule audience reflects a broader pattern among Holocaust deniers. Legal consequences and a more aware public has faded them into irrelevance, and now these deniers are naught but relics of a bygone era of pseudo-scholarship, their influence eroded to the point of virtual non-existence. You, in my opinion. Even the mighty IHR has all but fallen. The Journal of Historical Review ceased publication in 2002, a move attributed both to falling readership and the IHR's old donors dying and leaving their money to their more connected to reality children who didn't continue their forerunners' patronage. Now it publishes its journal articles exclusively through its website and pumps out but a fraction of the books that it did at its peak. But while we may be ending this chapter on a positive note, a dark cloud lingers over the horizon for our next one. Because while traditional Holocaust denial might be all but dead, something applied a defibrillator to denialism just as it was about to draw its final breath: the internet.
The internet, Buzz.
What the f*** is the internet?
The internet is a communications tool used the world over where people can come together to bitch about movies and share pornography with one another.
Tragically, in the online space, Holocaust denial is more accessible than ever, whereas before it was reasonably difficult to access, typically needing active thought to seek out and find denialist materials through the specialist authors and publications that produced it. Now, all you need to do is consume any Holocaust materials in the online space, and you're no more than a few clicks of your mouse or a few flicks of your scroll wheel away from some denialist materials. Even on this show, I'm willing to bet if you head down to the comment section and select newest, there will be stuff down there. Often online spaces dedicated to free speech, such as 4chan and its infamous /poll board, and previously Reddit before a 2020 hate speech crackdown, became nexuses of denialist materials, with these platforms' emphasis on free speech, allowing the formation of dedicated communities of deniers tucked deep into their deepest recesses. I was going to include some examples here, but they are bad, as in so bad that if I included them in this show, it would almost certainly be removed. So use your imagination to fill in the blanks, or if you're feeling particularly brave, give it a search for yourself after we're finished. Oh, just don't. Regarding 4chan, the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, has documented the proliferation of denialism on the site and believes that it has played a significant role in the resurgence of not just denialism, but in far-right movements more generally, particularly among young users who may stumble upon these ideas and accept them as truth due to the lack of counter-narratives within these echo chambers. Dr. Joan Donovan, the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy, dubbed this a petri dish effect, where denialism, left unchecked, is allowed to grow and fester within its own isolated space. I should point out, however, in the name of fairness, that not all of 4chan is Holocaust denial. It is isolated within specific boards on the site. Yeah, of course not. I feel I read about as much bad things about 4chan as I do about shit that just makes me laugh. They'll do some insane pranks, and I'm like, yeah, it was pretty funny. But then also there's Holocaust denial, which is, less funny. On Reddit, before its crackdown on hate speech, communities could overflow with denialism and anti-Semitic memes. So bad was the situation that r/Holocaust, ostensibly an innocent enough research and interest space, was completely taken over by deniers. The subreddit was eventually banned for repeated policy violations, but not before it became a case study in how digital communities can radicalize. Dr. Rebecca Lewis, a researcher on online extremism, points out that such spaces not only allow for the spread of hate, but by concentrating it in a single place, only for the members of that community to explode out into multiple different spaces and begin recruiting anew when their initial community is banned. Such environments are challenging to regulate due to the decentralized nature of the internet and the value placed on free expression. While steps have been taken by platform owners to address the worst offenses, the dynamic nature of online communities mean that as soon as one outlet is shut down, another springs up in its place. Experts continue to debate the best approaches to dealing with online hate, balancing the need to curb dangerous speech with the preservation of open discourse. Also note there is nothing inherently new about online Holocaust denial beside the medium through which it is communicated. The ideas and themes of it are a continuation of the old-school Holocaust denial we explored in previous chapters, simply repackaged and distributed anew on the internet. Revisionist interpretations of history, misrepresentation of facts and statistics, misquoting legitimate sources, and sometimes just flatly lying, it's all there, just as it has always been. What's really worrisome, however, isn't the mere continuation of Holocaust denial in the online space, but it appears to have grown more rapidly than it ever could have done back in the old days, and that it has, in some ways, integrated with a broader spectrum of global conspiracy narratives rather than simply being espoused in isolate. Now, it isn't uncommon to find someone who espouses denialism, and they also buy into other wacky ideas like QAnon, Great Replacement Theory, and the 9/11 Truth Movement. They're all regularly packaged up with it, at which point the Jews are often held up as the grand Machiavellian puppet master behind it all. For example, Ghost Ezra, a leading influencer in the QAnon movement, just happens to be a Hitler enjoyer who puts the Jews at the head of the conspiracy. Others in the space will claim that the international Jewry is the secret driving force behind mass immigration to Western nations, or that 4,000 Jews mysteriously never turned up to work on 9/11. Needless to say, all of these claims are utter nonsense. And don't think for a second that this online denialism lives just on the free speech-orientated platforms, because if you go looking for it, you can find it nearly everywhere, lurking in the darkest depths of otherwise perfectly reputable sites. Check out the comments below. On iFunny, for example, a site usually known for its light-hearted content, tags such as holo-hoax propagate denialism alongside grand theories of Jewish global control. But credit where it's due to iFunny, as we don't wish to defame them here, attempts are made to crack down on such content, such as the banning of the original holo-hoax, but ultimately by using alt accounts and algorithm-dodging tags such as Jews, spelt Joos. Oh, I see. Oh yeah, clever. Such material continues to spread despite iFunny's best efforts. I've never heard of iFunny. Similarly, on Telegram, channels such as holo-hoax, typhus, Course, push all the usual talking points that we're now familiar with. But with Telegram's focus on free speech, just like 4chan, we didn't include it earlier as it's a messenger app rather than a discussion board, minimal effort is made to curtail such discussions, with it being so pervasive that a UN report published in 2020 found that 80% of all German language messages discussing the Holocaust on it are denialist, with the number being 50% for French and English language messages. When pushed for comments on this, Telegram themselves simply commented that Telegram is a platform for free speech where people are welcome to peacefully express their opinions, including those we do not agree with. Yeah, I also mean like 80% of German language messages discussing the Holocaust are denialist. It's not super surprising because people who believe in the Holocaust don't spend a lot of time talking about the Holocaust. You're like, yeah, the Holocaust, it was terrible. It happened. I don't think about it very much. But if I'm like a nut job and I'm like super into like conspiracy about denying the Holocaust, then yeah, I'm going to be into it a lot more. Holocaust denial can also be found on blogs, with an example being the Realist Report. Fortunately, denialist blogs, just like blogs in general, to be fair, appear to be all but dead, usurped by more modern mediums. Using the Realist Report as an example again, it's unclear what its circulation is, but given the fact that barely 4,000 accounts follow it on Twitter, we can assume its reach is minimal at best. I have more followers than that, for God's sake, and I think even calling me a Z-list internet celebrity would be generous. The giants of the internet, at least, Facebook, YouTube, and the like, are fastidious about removing denialist content. YouTube implemented a fat ban on such content in 2019, and now videos uploaded to the site are automatically scanned for such materials, and publishing will be denied if discovered. Furthermore, any that slip through the algorithm are purged from the moment they're discovered. It's a similar situation with Facebook, with the site flatly banning denialist materials in 2020 and now automatically scanning for and removing such content. Yeah, I imagine if you upload a denialist thing to YouTube, they're going to delete the video and you're going to get, like, there's these thing called community guideline strikes where you do something against community guidelines and you get 3 of them, and if you use them all up, then you get banned. I imagine shit like this, it's just like, you're out, right? Also, with big platforms, even before these bans, community self-regulation typically kept the worst denialism in check, with far larger and far more representative of real-world user bases of these platforms organically creating backlash sufficient to either bury the content deep in the algorithm or see it willingly removed. This is typified by a 2019 YouTube video uploaded by AJ+, an online platform run by the Al Jazeera network, titled "What is the truth behind the Holocaust, and how did the Zionist movement benefit from it?" Bruh. This video was exactly what it sounded like, and the backlash from it was so great that AJ+ willingly took it down and fired the 2 employees responsible for its production and posting. Goddamn right. We must also consider the role of algorithms in proliferating denialist material online. In their conception, algorithms in social media are quite a clever idea. They learn who you are and push content you're liable to like. Normally, no stress if my suggested feed takes me down a surprisingly interesting model railway rabbit hole. You're damn right I want more of that good stuff in my feed. But when applied to denialism, it becomes altogether darker. To explain further, if a user engages with denialist content, there is the chance the algorithm may suggest more of the same, leading the user down the path of increasingly extreme content. Studies have shown that once users enter this algorithm-driven pathway, they can find themselves stuck in an echo chamber, with the well-meaning algorithm thinking it is doing nothing but helping retain that customer's clicks. And I mean, it is. It is. Echo chambers can be extremely dangerous. They reinforce extreme beliefs and create tight-knit communities that normalize misinformation. Within these digital bubbles, denialism can thrive unchecked, as dissenting voices and factual counter-arguments are systematically filtered out. Fortunately, at least, since the mainstream platforms have a hard crackdown on denialist materials, such algorithmic rabbit holes are at least a lot harder to fall down now. Throughout this chapter, a single phrase has continually reared its head: free speech. And this raises a very interesting debate, because while I'm sure we're all in agreement that Holocaust denial should be combated, how far should we go to achieve that end? Advocates for unrestricted free speech assert that the best approach to counter Holocaust denial is through open discussion, where false narratives can be directly challenged and debunked. Those proponents often cite the potential for overreach, where restrictions on speech might suppress legitimate discourse and academic freedom. They argue that the answer to bad speech is more speech, not less. Contrastingly, those in favor of restrictions contend that such content is inherently harmful, perpetuating falsehoods that can incite hatred and violence. This is a complicated one, isn't it? Because I feel it's much easier to get hooked into a conspiracy than it is to get hooked out of a conspiracy for whatever reason. Like, people fall into conspiracy theories, and I feel it's hard for them to get out of it. Like, they just get locked into that thinking, which is quite dangerous. Yeah, it's a tricky issue, isn't it? They argue that Holocaust denial is not merely an expression of opinion, but an assault on truth that undermines the dignity of survivors and victims. Scholars like Deborah Lipstadt, who has published extensively on Holocaust denial, supports educational efforts and legal measures to combat the spread of such dangerous misinformation up to and including censorship online. On the other side of the debate, we have Nadine Strossen, a former president of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, and a prominent law professor who holds a libertarian view that emphasizes the potential risks of censorship. She argues that suppression of free speech can backfire, often driving prohibited ideas underground where they may flourish without challenge. The ACLU, historically wary of any form of censorship, upholds the principle that the protection against hate speech should come from counter-speech and education rather than bans or legal sanctions. In the academic realm, people like Timothy Garton Ash have explored the concept of free speech but not cheap speech, the idea that while free speech is a fundamental right and essential for a healthy democracy, it should not be a free-for-all platform for spreading misinformation, hate speech, or harmful propaganda. Then there's Cass Sunstein, a legal scholar. Favoring the restrictive side of the argument, Sunstein has proposed the concept of group libel laws, which would offer protection against hate speech that vilifies a group and incites public hostility. He posits that such laws, already in place in several democracies, mitigate the spread of denialism without encroaching significantly on individuals' right to free speech. Conversely, scholars such as Erich Heinz challenge the efficacy of hate speech laws, arguing that they can be counterproductive. Heinz suggests that such regulations often fail to protect the intended beneficiaries and can even hinder efforts to combat bigotry. He advocates for unrestricted expression, contending that open dialogue is more effective in confronting and discrediting harmful ideologies. God, this is a hell of a debate, isn't it? I don't know where I stand on this. I really don't. Like, in some ways, I'm like, yeah, people should be able to say what they want. But also, I don't want people spreading propaganda. Tricky. People have lots of opinions on this stuff. Then Jonathan Rauch, a strong proponent of free speech absolutism, argues that the best way to counter bad ideas, including Holocaust denial, is through public debate and criticism, not censorship. Rauch believes that all ideas, even the most repugnant, should compete in the marketplace of ideas. Supporting the more regulatory side, Jeremy Waldron comes in full support of hate speech laws, emphasizing the importance of protecting the dignity of individuals in a well-ordered society. Waldron's work suggests that public order includes the moral order of society, and hate speech disrupts this by marginalizing and demeaning targeted groups. Finally, Danielle Citron, a legal scholar specializing in information privacy, has linked the online harassment facilitated by hate speech to civil rights violations. She calls for a considered approach to regulation that would treat serious, pervasive online abuse as the civil rights violation that it is. With our academic perspectives out of the way, we get to the most important opinion of all, mine, as in George's. Because as a graduate of a slightly crap university with absolutely no professional experience in all matters of free speech, I'm almost certainly the most qualified man on earth to be wading in and giving his 2 cents on this highly nuanced issue. And this is my take, and I absolutely have no idea. And my opinion, which make no mistake, I absolutely do have, is almost certainly biased and overly emotional, and absolutely not worth sharing with you all. So rather than sharing my thoughts, let me turn it on a man with a much more informed and worldly view than myself, our venerable host Simon. Simon, do you believe it's worth restricting free speech to be able to combat Holocaust denial? Oh, don't do this to me, George. I don't know. It's obviously a super complex issue. Do I think that someone should be publishing a video on YouTube where they're just ranting that the Holocaust didn't happen? Gosh, I want to say yes. Yes. Oh, I don't know, but then people get trapped into this, and then there's young and impressionable people. Oh, I don't know. I really don't know. It's way above my pay grade. Why? And so we find ourselves at the end of our rather deep dive into the history of Holocaust denial. That leaves us with just one last thing to do before we bring this episode to a close. And that being to ask ourselves why. Why do people entertain Holocaust denial? What are their motivations? Are there any psychological traits that predispose people to believing in it? And so on and so forth. Fortunately, we don't have to rely upon the musings of our own tiny, smooth brains, for I've scoured far and wide to assemble a list of expert-endorsed motivating factors that'll help us out. The first is the desire for understanding and certainty. People naturally seek explanations for significant events, especially those that are traumatic or perplexing. In a study titled Too Much of a Good Thing, The Paradox of Confidence, published in 2012, a group of researchers found that overconfidence is often associated with a desire for certainty. Conspiracy theories often offer a seemingly coherent narrative that makes sense of an otherwise chaotic reality and thus proves psychologically comforting. People prefer explanations that neatly fit into their pre-existing beliefs or worldview, or at least allow them to easily arrive at a conclusion without having to challenge their preconceptions or consider difficult topics, a concept known as cognitive consonance. To me, this would describe the first generation of early mass Holocaust denial. Such a horrific event was so inconceivable to them that they simply denied it rather than accept the bare and difficult questions about man's inhumanity to man. In addition to cognitive consonance, we also have cognitive dissonance as a potential explanation. First coined by Leon Festinger in his seminal work 1957, A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, it describes the psychological discomfort experienced when an individual is presented with information that fundamentally contradicts their pre-existing beliefs or values and the irrational beliefs that grow therefrom. Rather than altering, this is such a good piece, it's such a clever idea. Rather than altering their worldview, individuals with this often resort to denial or revision of the facts to alleviate their mental strife. This can naturally lead to Holocaust denial. An individual finds that the irrefutable evidence clashes with personal or ideological beliefs, Germanophilia, Nazism, etc., and as a response, they deny the Holocaust flatly to avoid having to question those deeply held beliefs. I personally think this fits most of the deniers that we discussed today. Mass Holocaust denial after the war, a result of a contradiction in the perception of the world. Mass Holocaust denial after the war, a result of a contradiction in their perception of the world. Hogan, a clear inability to reconcile his positive opinions of Germany with its foul deeds of World War II. The same for Irving. After all, he was clearly a man who held Germany in high regard, hence his moving there when he bailed on conscription. Another motivation is desire for control and security. In a world that can seem unpredictable and threatening, believing in conspiracy theories can provide an illusion of control and predictability. This is supported by research by Jennifer Whitson and Adam Galinsky in the 2008 paper Lacking Control Increases Illusory Pattern Perception, which suggests that a lack of control leads to a heightened tendency to find patterns where none exist. This motivated reasoning, as expanded upon by Ziva Kunder in a 1990 paper, The Case for Motivated Reasoning, allows individuals to arrive at conclusions that satisfy their needs and desires rather than those supported by evidence. I believe Bardesh is this kind of denier. As a neo-fascist, he had lack of control by holding beliefs that made him a pariah in the post-war world, and in trying to find patterns to justify these beliefs, he arrived at Holocaust denial. Then there's the desire to maintain a positive self-image. Social psychologist Karen Douglas, in a 2003 paper, Psychological Motives and Political Orientation, The Left, the Right, and the Rigid, comment on Jost et al., argues that social marginalization can lead to adopting conspiracy theories. For those who feel disenfranchised by mainstream society, conspiracy theories can provide a sense of community and an avenue to express their grievances. They can also bolster self-worth by providing believers with a sense of being privy to special knowledge that others don't possess. I think we might be onto a winner with this one, as many of the deniers we discussed today seem to match this trope. Again, Bardesh, who has seen his worldview thoroughly defeated in World War II, was able to cling to Holocaust denial as a psychological defense following his ostracization by polite society for being a neo-fascist. It also fits for David Irving. When Hitler's war proved contentious, doubling down on his sympathetic views of Hitler and downing the Kool-Aid gave him an answer to his sudden disenfranchisement from society. Finally, I also believe it fits for App. After his isolationist views saw him fired, he found a community and was eventually fully radicalized by American Nazis, thus providing him with a sense of community when he was purged from academia and lost that which he had previously had. Yeah, I think this is so true. Often the extreme views come from people who are not succeeding in society, or are not in functional society, or are at the edges, marginalized. They tend to gravitate towards these things, which in a way I kind of believe we shouldn't necessarily be. Is it really best to combat the conspiracy theories and and not just conspiracy theories, but these kind of extreme views that some people develop in these internet echo chambers? Isn't it better to try and bring those people into society, which is mostly good and functional, rather than keep them marginalized where they're attracted to these groups? And it's just I think of incels. Incels is kind of that modern example. It's people who are sort of marginalized on the outside of society. They group together and they form these weird things. Whereas really, isn't it better to just kind of be yeah, society's cool. Come over here. Enjoy. It's all good. It's way more complicated than that, obviously. I know. Just a thought. Another interesting explanation can be found in Karen Douglas, Robbie Sutton, and Alexandra Chichoka's 2017 paper, The Psychology of Conspiracy Theories. They found that people with lower self-esteem, a strong need for uniqueness, and even narcissistic tendencies are far more likely to believe in conspiracy theories, including Holocaust denial. Again, I think David Irving is a great fit here. His two bungled attempts at higher education, coupled with his bailing on conscription in such a nationalistic and patriotic era, are hardly likely to have bred a high self-esteem, and I can easily see this being one of the motivators for him embracing Holocaust denial in a desperate attempt to appear unique as a historian. Does low self-esteem and narcissism, aren't they kind of mutually exclusive? If you're narcissistic, surely you got high self-esteem because you're like, I'm awesome. But despite this litany of explanations, one denier escapes me. Rattinger. For all my reading, desperate to find a theory that explains why, despite being a wartime anti-Nazi and Holocaust survivor, he would sink into denialism, I just can't figure it out. So let me put it back to Simon. How would you explain him? I can't, George. Like, that's throughout the whole section, I'm just like, why? Brain tumor? I don't know. Conclusion. And so our journey down the long and loathsome road of Holocaust denial has reached its end. In the last 90 or so minutes, sort of, we have gained a thorough understanding of denialism's history by looking at the evolution of its key thinkers and ideas, and have also delved into some possible explanations of what motivates people to believe such objectively incorrect ideas. But unfortunately, at the end of this journey, we find ourselves having to accept an unpleasant reality. That being that Holocaust denial doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. We came so close to extinguishing it at the turn of the millennium, only for the internet to rip off its shirt, apply the defibrillator, and bring it back to life with more vigor than it's had for decades. It's exactly because of this fact that an episode such as this is so important. Sure, the history and ideas are interesting enough to learn about, but if we are to live in a world beset by denialism for the foreseeable future, it is crucial that the majority of us understand both the ideas of deniers and the evidence we can use to counter them. To that end, I hope this podcast proved useful to you, and of course, I hope you found it interesting. Thank you for watching.